Okay, at the end of the video yesterday from Swanholme Lakes, I promised that I'd do another video soon to critique the photos that I took and explain my sort of reasoning behind them and what I might do differently next time, etc., etc. I did originally hope to stick them on yesterday's video, but it would have been far too long, so that's why it's going to be a separate one. And it's the first time I've done this as a YouTube video, so it's an experiment for me as well. So we'll just see how it goes. And of course, any comments, any suggestions at the end will be gratefully received, because that's how the channel will develop. Okay, now this was one of the first photos I took. It's actually on the way to the nature reserve. This is the footpath between Doddington Road and Hartsholme Park, for those people that know Lincoln. And it's the way that I went in. I think it's the nicest way to get onto the nature reserve. It's a lovely path, and you can sometimes see kingfishers in the ditch that's off to the right in this picture. So anyway, so I thought I'd record that. It's a nice path, as I say. This is a nice photo without being anything spectacular. We've got the footpath leading off into the distance, which draws you in. It sort of disappears around a corner, which I personally like. Some people like to see their leading lines disappearing into the far distance and sort of infinity point. I like these sort of mysterious ones where they disappear around a corner. Now the trees themselves, they're okay. They're a bit samey. The colours are very similar. The autumn colours haven't really developed yet, so there's a heck of a lot of green in this photo. And there aren't really any major focal points, no fantastic individual trees anywhere. I say it's a nice enough image. It records the walk and the way into the nature reserve, but it's not something that you put up on your wall. It's it's average, records the place and not a lot else. Okay, see what we've got next. Now, this is when my heart leapt when I got onto the nature reserve. The light was absolutely stunning. Those dark skies, the sunlight illuminating the ground and the trees, bringing out the colours. If it had stayed like this the whole of the time I was there, I think I would have taken a lot more landscape shots and a lot less shots of mushrooms and fungi. But sadly, as you know, if you watched yesterday's video, the sun didn't stay out, so I didn't get that many photos like this. I mean, this sort of situation in many ways is ideal for landscape photographers. It's that low light. This was about 3:30 in the afternoon, which at the end of October is fairly low angled, not too harsh, fairly soft, almost golden hourish. The dark clouds in the background balance off the bright landscape, the bright trees. Colours are good. Everything sort of balances itself off tonally. I like the way that the lake curves around and disappears down into the distance. A little bit of foreground interest with the bushes and the brambles there. They're a little bit messy, and in some ways, if I use the pointer over here, just excuse the things that pop up when I move the mouse. But maybe if these bushes here had been a bit lower and you could see the full curve of the lake round there, that would be better. Excuse me. But you can't have everything. It's very rare that you'll get a photo that you consider to be perfect. I'm not sure I've ever had one yet. There's always something that we'd like to improve. But yeah, if these bushes here had been a bit lower and you could have seen more of the curve of the lake, that would have certainly helped for me. But the lighting I really like. I like the bigger trees on the left. The shape of the sort of the window where the sky comes through is quite nice. So there's a lot to like about this photo. Even though, as I say, you'd improve it if you had the chance. Okay. Now this is that avenue of silver birches that I talked about. It's one of my favourite parts of Swanholme Lakes. It's actually like a raised embankment between two lakes, and it's sort of a lovely tunnel. And this time of year, especially when the colours start to change, it's really very pretty, very photogenic. This photo itself, again, it's okay. The lighting by this point had got a little bit flat. It would have been nicer maybe if the tree trunks had been a bit better lit, a bit brighter. So it's a little bit flat, and the colours, again, like with the first image, they haven't turned that far yet into their oranges and browns, those sort of real autumn colours. The yellow's pretty good, but I'd like a bit more orange in there if possible. And the leading line, the path going down there and disappearing into the distance, that's all well and good. That maybe could have done with somebody on it, or a dog or a couple walking down there into the distance. All those sorts of things add interest. But it's not bad. It's a photogenic place, and you can spend a lot of time there, which I did. He's looking back the other way. You can see the colours are reversed. The more yellowy foliage and leaves is now on the left, and the greener is on the right. So it's very similar to the last image, really. This is probably not as good, actually, because there aren't so many obvious nice tree trunks. So maybe not quite as interesting as the last one. Again, could benefit from somebody walking down the path. Now, really like this one. This is what I went there to get. This is what I would always be pleased to get if I was photographing mushrooms. The light was perfect for the mushrooms. Once the shadows disappeared, once the light went in, I've done all the things with this image that I talked about in yesterday's video. The best way to photograph mushrooms or any small object, wildflowers, anything like that down on the ground, is firstly to get down to their level. And then I personally like to use a long lens, which creates a natural shallow depth of field. And then, again, as I said yesterday, choose the point of focus as the leading edge of the mushroom along here. And it doesn't matter then how much else is out of focus. That is the focal point. That's where your eye will be drawn. That's the point of interest. These nice little fins that come down, and you can see the textures on the edge of the mushroom, and they slowly blur into the distance, as does the foreground. So yeah, I really like this sort of image when I'm photographing mushrooms or wildflowers. Shallow depth of field, get a nice almost abstract bokeh at the back, blurred area. There's one or two things here that will change in an ideal world. Like, I don't like this little twig down here. These little straight lines, they seem out of place. There's another very fine one up there. They seem out of place here where everything's curved and very sort of random. I love these out of focus seed heads, almost the bauble effect that you get there in the foreground and some in the background. That's why I shoot shallow depth of field with these things. If you wanted a field guide to mushrooms, you would shoot them very differently. You would shoot them more from above, maybe at a 45-degree angle with a broader depth of field to try and keep as much of it in focus as possible. But I'm not making a field guide. I'm trying to do something a bit arty and a little bit nicer to look at. And yeah, I'm quite pleased how that one came out, really. There's not a lot that I could have done better, apart from getting maybe an even sharper focus. On the leading edge, it seems to be slightly back from it, if I'm being hypercritical about that. If you looked at it on the phone, you probably won't notice. On a big screen, it leaps out at me a little bit. But anyway, yeah, really happy with that one. Now, to prove a point, that's your field guide shot. That one was shot with the wider zoom, my 17 to 50 Sigma zoom, and that's probably at about the 50 end. So you've got a much broader depth of field, much more of the cap of the mushroom is in focus, more of the foreground down here, the leaves, that twig, a lot more in focus than the previous image. But you've still got, because you've got relative shallow depth of field still, with a nice wide aperture. You've got this beautiful bokeh in the background. I love this sort of, again, it's sort of the abstract effect that you get from leaves and the forest floor. Lovely combination of colours, and the orangey red really pops. So again, I really like that one, but for different reasons to the previous image with its shallow depth of field. This is less arty, but I think it's still got a pretty image, nice colour palette. That's a nice one. And now going to the other extreme, now getting a really long lens out again. This is the 200mm end of my long zoom, and closing right up as much as I possibly could. There's a huge fault in this, as I'm sure you've already spotted, or something that leaps out and annoys me, and that's the fly. When I first saw that fly there, I thought, oh, this could be interesting, and a little fly under there, but it would only have been interesting if it had been sharp. That nasty little brown blob under there just distracts for me, and takes away quite a bit from what otherwise would be a really nice photo, because again, focus on the leading edge of the fly agaric mushroom. The colours are nice, nice details there, lovely bouquet in the background. Yeah, damn fly ruined that one really. We live and learn. This is similar to the 1, 2 or 3 back with the fly agaric down there, ground level, shooting across straight at this this mushroom. Different colour palette this time, more subtle shades, no big bold red popping out. Lots of nice details, these fins under here. I like this more subtle colour palette as well. It's quite a nice image. The one thing that annoys me about this one is that I allowed the white edge up here to get slightly blown out. Whether I could have recovered that, or could still go back and recover a bit of that in Photoshop, calm that white down and get a little bit more detail. You can see there is a bit of detail in there if you look closely, but yeah, that's a little bit of a niggly annoyance. But otherwise, I quite like that one. Well worth getting down and muddy for. This is sort of a nothing image, really. It's okay, but I've sort of tried to do 2 things and hit neither, really. The depth of field isn't shallow enough to be sharp along the edge and create an arty image, and it's not broad enough to give the field guide type image. So although you can see a lot more of the cap of the mushroom, that's probably a photo that I would not be sharing if I hadn't already popped it up there and decided to in the video yesterday. So warts and all, this one, but yeah, a few things wrong with that. This is variation of my lay down on the ground and focus on the closest object to you, which is a tactic I often resort to when I'm frustrated with the light or subject matter. Swanholme Lakes is an old sand and gravel pit, so there are quite a few little piles of gravel like this, old river gravels from the end of the last ice age, for those that are interested. The plan with these sorts of images is to focus as close to the camera as you possibly can, hopefully on something of interest, and then just allow the focus and everything to become more and more blurred the further away you go, until you get a semi-abstract background, which works pretty well up to a point. I like the way the pebbles do fade away into a blur. It's just a shame that I couldn't get more interesting rocks to focus on. At the time, I remember thinking that these 3 pebbles were more interesting than they really are when I get to look at them. But yeah, just imagine if that if you found a really nice rock here, brightly coloured one, or one with a nice fossil in it, or even a nice big leaf, which I've done before in photos, as some of you will recognise. Yeah, if there was more interest here, a little bit more pop and bounce in the photo, that would have been a really good idea, but it just fell a little bit short there because those pebbles weren't quite as interesting as I thought at first. Now, this is one of the big photo merge panoramas that I talked about trying in the video when I was trying to find a way to bring in those huge skies, those big interesting dramatic clouds, and also the wonderful colours in the trees. Now, I really like this because I did capture the dramatic sky and I did balance it nicely with the trees and the colours in the landscape. The reflections in the lake worked out pretty cool, but it's not quite balanced, as I'm sure most of you are screaming at your screen whenever you're viewing this on. The problem is the trees. I think the trees on the right hand side are wonderful. They're generally quite big, that little one in there just for a bit of variation. There's lots of different colours. There's hints of orangey brown over here, then we go through greens and slight greys, muted yellowy greens, darker greens again, almost quite orange, almost a reddy brown in there, back to green again. We've got lots of variation over here, quite a lot of interest, but they're just not balanced over on this side, where we've got two trees that aren't really big enough and aren't really nicely coloured. They're the same colour, same type of tree probably, which they're fine on their own, but it unbalances the photo. So if only I could have moved that silver birch there with the reddy brown leaves on the top, move that one and stuck it between those two, that would have been a lot better. But short of a chainsaw and a gang of strong lads, that ain't going to happen. Now, I did try other things with this. I tried to move to the right. I know I did that to try to balance it, because I knew that that left-hand side was going to be a bit weak. But when you turned around more to the right, there were some overhanging branches that crept in here, and they unbalanced the photo even more in different ways. So that wasn't really an option. I also did some single images that sort of covered that area, and they worked okay, but you lost a lot of the interesting sky. So again, this is a sort of a compromise image that I quite like, but every time I look at it, I just wish there was another tree on the left, and preferably an orangey yellow one. So yeah, it's nice, but the more I look at it, the more I see things that I'd change. Now this was shortly after, and the light had really gone now off the trees, so the leaves aren't quite as bright, the colours don't pop quite as much. You've still got the dramatic sky there with those wonderful clouds that were churning around. It was quite windy, so you could literally see these swirling around and changing before your eyes. So I was glad that I managed to get that in there in that nice window framed there. The trees in the centre, all being the same colour, don't seem to matter so much in this image, because there is more balance between the left and the right, and they just have to be smaller in the centre, framing the window of the clouds. There's also a sort of a subtle frame around the bottom here with the willow on the left and the leaves floating on the surface of the pond, which tend to be just around the edge. If they'd have been all over the lake, sort of all up here as well, I think that would have detracted, but they sort of create a bit of a frame, a nice bottom to root the photo. Anyway, yes, this is another 3-shot photo merge panorama. Again, all the individual photos are portrait orientation, so there's one down the left, one down the middle, one down the right. Yeah, I'm not sure whether I like it more than the other big panorama. This one is better balanced, but it loses something in that the trees aren't so well lit. It doesn't pop so nicely. So that's a bit of a trade-off, really. And as I said before, it's very rare that you get perfection in a photo. There's always something you wish was better, or that you could improve on. But in the way the conditions were, and the way the light was getting flatter all the time, I'm glad that I managed to get some nice landscapes out of it. And so yeah, this one will do, but I'd like to go back again with better light, but wouldn't we always, eh? Now this is another of my favourites from the day. Another fly agaric, was a little one this time. Love the colour, the combinations of the browns down the bottom and the yellows and the greens at the top. A nice merge with, against the shallow depth of field, which creates that lovely background, the bokeh, as we call it, the blurred out of focus background. Because this was a smaller mushroom, I've managed, even with a fairly shallow depth of field, to get most of the cap in focus, which is quite an achievement with these, but it helps when they're small. So that also helps the image pop, and it makes the little mushroom more 3D than if I'd just concentrated on the leading edges you have to do on some of the bigger ones. It was only after I'd blown this up on a big screen on the computer that I noticed these tiny little mushrooms down here as well. Now these must only be about 1 centimetre high, and we'll come on to those later, because they created quite an interesting problem later, trying to photograph little mushrooms like that. But anyway, yeah, as I say, this is one of my favourite images of the day. There's not much in this that I would improve, really. There's nothing that leaps out at me and makes me scream, "Oh God, why did I do that?" Or "I wished I'd moved to the left or the right," or "Why, slightly different settings," or whatever. I think the lighting worked on this, the composition, the colours. I pretty well nailed this one, I think. I'm not going to say it's perfect, because somebody will find something really annoying in it, and then it'll annoy me. But yeah, I'm really, really chuffed with that one. Pretty happy. Now, same mushroom, but I did something a little bit different with this one. I very rarely do this. Just occasionally, if an idea comes in my head, I start tinkering with Mother Nature. Now, these pine cones weren't there in the original photo, but I got this little idea into my head, and the pine cones were just off to the right, if I remember right. There's lots and lots of them on the forest floor. But I just thought I'd do this little exercise, more as a technical exercise and a sort of a teaching thing, really, rather than to create a particular individual image. And it's about different focus around the image, using different objects to lead the eye in different ways. So here I've focused on the mushroom again, and the pine cones are nothing more than a little blurred distraction in the foreground. And maybe they lead you in, maybe they don't. Maybe after you've looked at the mushroom, you just think, "Oh, there's pine cones there." Okay, so that's one way of doing it. But then, and instead of focusing on the mushroom in the back, I focused on the pine cones in the foreground. Now, the mushroom is still there. It's still obviously a mushroom. The colour palette is still the same. But I just think this is a more interesting image than the last one. And it's just different to see something other than a mushroom for a start. But joking apart, it's more of a technical exercise, as I say, and a sort of a teaching tool about selective focus, and just thinking about the object that you want to be the main centre of attention. And that maybe, if you choose the pine cones, as in this case, to be the main centre of attention, maybe there's also something in the background that is so big and bold that even if it's out of focus, it still draws the eye in and gives you sort of something extra to take away from the image. So I prefer that one to that one, personally. Okay, but you might have a different view. And this is another shot. I think this was a single one rather than a photo merge this time. Again, after the light had gone, and it was an attempt to balance the ground, the trees, and the dark sky. And I had to do a bit more photoshopping in this, because in the original image, I obviously had to underexpose it slightly to get some details in the clouds, although I've still lost some. And in doing that, I made the trees and the ground, the landscape part of the shot, I made that too dark. Now imagine if I'd darkened it even more to bring out more detail in the sky, it would have been sort of irretrievable, really. The trees would bring much detail back out of them. So this was a compromise image, really. I had to lighten the trees in Photoshop and the lake, the landscape part of the shot, and darken the sky a little bit. But I think that compromise worked pretty well, to be honest. There isn't too much sky in the shot. There's just a hint of the drama in the clouds there. The overhanging tree here fills a bit of a void, and it covers some of what would have been more boring clouds behind there. You can just see it's more uniform grey there, so that helps coming in there, and it balances the image off, I think, with the bigger trees on the right. The reflections are pretty cool. There aren't too many leaves on the surface distracting. Maybe in an ideal world, a duck down here in the bit of open water, that little bit of, it's not exactly dead space, but more empty space. Maybe a duck down there or a swan would have added something to it. But considering the situation and the relatively flat light, I'm quite glad of the balance that I got in this one, really. It doesn't pop as much as it would if the light had been brighter, but I think I made something out of a bad job there. Did better than I thought I would anyway. Now, this was another experiment that I had with mixed success. It's the shallow depth of field again, focusing on these dead seed heads from the heather. I love certain aspects of this photo, and I really dislike others. This seed head here was meant to be the main point of focus, and I've missed that slightly because it was blowing in the wind. It's not as sharp as it really needed to be to hold the eye. I love these bits at the back. I love this bauble effect that you get when seed heads go slightly out of focus. Also a bit up the middle there and some over to the right. And I like the colour palette of this one, but it's just a bit of a mess. It's a jumble, really. I messed up with the centre point there. If I'd have got that more in focus and sharper, I think it would have helped. But generally, it's too messy. I like the blurred background, as I say, but generally it's too messy. But you know, it's lessons learned. Now this one, this is one of those tiny little mushrooms I was talking about that were barely a centimetre high, and very hard to photograph. They were very small, really deep down in the foliage, so it's very dark. This is with a 200mm lens again. I love aspects of this image. I love the real crazy out of focus mess all around it. I say mess, I don't mean mess because that sounds negative. It's just crazy. It's almost like a sort of a nebula in space, apart from it's a strange colour for a nebula. But these sort of greens and yellows, little orangey browns in there. I love that, little bits of textures. It's just crazy. It's just bits of grass and leaves, all sorts of things, all sort of jumbled up in this crazy bouquet. The problem with it is that it was quite dark. I was literally laid on my stomach shooting through all manner of grass and foliage, and I just could not get the lens to focus along here. That's where I was meant to be focusing on the leading edge again, but it was so tiny. It was really difficult. And again, it might look fine on your phone, but if you get it on a big screen, it's really not as sharp as I would have liked. But as a semi-abstract image, I really like it. And again, it's well worth experimenting with these things. No way can you predict this sort of crazy out of focus background, the swirls and little patterns and colours. But yeah, if only I'd nailed the focus on there. But yeah, you can't have everything. Again, do better next time. This one was during the phase when I was trying to ignore the sky and forget there was a big dramatic sky up there and just try to photograph the trees and the landscape and the lake. And again, there's some successes here, but some failures. And you could divide this down the middle, I think, and it's almost two photos left and right. With the left-hand side is a semi-abstract mess of leaves and their reflections, whereas the right is a bit better defined with the tree trunks and the stumps on the front. Even the lake edge is better defined here, and the reflections are less cluttered. Neither side really pops. I think the right hand side is better in some ways, left hand side better in others. If you wanted an abstract image, take the left hand side. If you want something a little bit less abstract and a little bit more natural, then take the right hand side. But I think both sides fall short really of what I would have liked to have done if I possibly could have done it. So again, it's lessons learned. The light really wasn't great for landscape photography, and so my mind wandered and I lost the composition of this one really. So as I say, I ended up getting two photos in one, and the two sides don't really complement each other. I don't think anyway. And this is similar idea, even more cluttered. The colours are just too similar. The textures are too similar. There's a lot of different stuff in there, but it's all green or yellow, and it's all very detailed. So if the reeds along the foreground here, if they'd have been bigger, bolder, maybe a couple of bulrushes, there's one there and one over there. If they'd been those big sort of bulrushes or cattails, as Americans call them, bigger and bolder, different colours, brown, maybe they would have stood out better. But here, the foreground reeds just blur into the leafy reflections on the pond, which blur into the trees and the bushes on the far side, which are all a very, very similar colour. So again, here's this area of lovely trees and silver birches. it's just lost. So yeah, it's a nice enough image. It's not a terrible image. It just falls short in lots of ways. It's too much going on and not enough to focus your attention. It is similar, slightly better in that there is less going on in the foreground, so the reflections stand out a bit better. And I think the colours are also a bit bolder in this one, so they stand out a little bit better. There are things, again, that the grasses along the bottom, those little things annoy me. I think it's important when you're thinking about your composition and you're looking at your photos, especially as well when you're cropping them later, when you're editing them, check round the edges of your photos, little things creeping on the edges that can distract the eye, and things like the grasses along the bottom here particularly annoy me. But the trouble is, without maybe standing on a 10-foot ladder, if you crop them out, you'd also crop the bottom of the reflections out as well. You need to be higher up, so you've got clearer water along the bottom here under the reflections. But again, you can't always have everything. Mother Nature sets things out her way. She doesn't set them out for photographers. But yeah, that's maybe a lesson from this one, apart from the flat light. But yeah, check around the edges of your photos and look for things that are sneaking in there that are just distractions and don't add anything. Now, these tiny little mushrooms, and they're missing the focus again. I'm never going to get all of them in focus, obviously. I try to focus here, and it's not too bad, but they are so small, and they were moving in the wind. And there's probably too much going on. The colours are nice, the shapes are interesting. Maybe if there were less mushrooms, maybe it would have worked better. And if I could have just managed to hit that focus a bit better as well. But this is the problem when you're shooting really, really tiny things, and and the wind's blowing them around a bit as well. So that was an interesting exercise. Let's go back, get it sharper and maybe less cluttered. It was a strange fungus. I only saw one of these. Not sure what they're called, but it was growing on a tree stump. And I love the scalloped textures and the stripes, the colours. I think I've made a mistake with this photo, and I chose the wrong one really in lots of ways. I took about 4 photos of this fungus, and this is the widest angle showing the stump that they were growing on, and a bit of the grass and the lichens and the leaf litter down the bottom. And the best photos that I took of this fungus were much closer in and cropped, so there was no extraneous nonsense around the edges. It was just all about these wonderful curves and scallops and stripes. But yeah, for some reason when I was putting the video together yesterday, I thought this was the better of the 4 photos, and that the extra stuff around the edge added interest. But the more I look at it, the more I think that it just adds distraction, and that I should have gone with a tighter crop. But there again, keep looking at things, you keep seeing different things. Now this is another attempt at trying to get some interest out of the trees and the forest, and ignoring the sky and the flat light, and chose this silver birch trunk on the left as sort of the initial thing to grab the eye, and then the gap down the middle to lead you in. How well that works, I suppose, is up to the viewers to tell me. The colours are pretty cool. I like the silver birches. I think they're always very photogenic. Maybe again, it's one of these cases where yes, there's a sort of leading line in there. It's not particularly well defined. Maybe could do with something else in there, a person or a dog walking through there, running through, something like that, just to give it that little bit extra. So yeah, it's an okay image, but the light was too flat really for this sort of thing. So again, it's another illustration of why I didn't take that many landscapes, because the light really wasn't conducive. Whereas it was conducive to the mushrooms. As I keep saying, there's no such thing as bad light, just the wrong light for what you want to shoot. And this wasn't really the day for landscapes. Now this one is interesting. This was shot almost as I left. In fact, I had actually walked out of the nature reserve and then this caught my eye over my sort of my left shoulder, and at first I thought it was backlight, because these bracken fronds are particularly beautiful when they are backlit, but of course the sun had disappeared maybe an hour before, and it just happened to be a few plants that were in a slight clearing, and they just happened to be more brightly lit, just in the ambient light, I suppose, than the surrounding trees and the forest. So they stood out as being really bright against the darker backgrounds. So I nipped back up the embankment and took a few quick shots of them. Again, I love the colour, I love the background, the patterns. They're so photogenic, these bracken fronds. You can't go wrong with them, really. It's just a shame that there weren't any that were truly backlit. In fact, I did take a couple of backlit bracken fronds just as I walked into the nature reserve, pretty much at the start of the walk, but I didn't bother about composition at all. I just took some quick shots just to get an idea of what the light was and what settings would work, expecting the sun to stay out a lot longer and have lots more opportunities to do it. But I didn't. I didn't get a single other opportunity to do backlit leaves or bracken. So this was a bit of a bonus right at the end. It works pretty well, considering the light was poor, and it gives the impression that it was backlit even though it wasn't, as I say. So there's a little bit of a nice trick with this one. But yeah, it was a nice little surprise to get just as I was leaving anyway. And yeah, well, that's it, I think. As I say, please comment constructive criticism more than just moans, please. Be gentle. This is the first of these types of videos that I've done. They are warts and all. I'm not the sort of photographer that goes out and takes 200 photos and goes home and decides that 2 of them are perfect and they're the ones that I'll share and the rest go in the bin. I tend to keep a large proportion of my photos, even if they are warts and all, because for me it's as much about recording the walk, recording the place and that time, as it is creating perfect art, which will either come or it won't. And most of the time it doesn't, so you have to go with the flawed product, and there's very rarely is there such a thing as a perfect image. When I say I would rather have a record of 60 nice photos so I can remember the walk and remember the place than bin 99% of them just to keep 1 or 2 that I consider to be perfect. That's just how my photographer's mind operates. Everybody's slightly different, so again that might be something to discuss. But I think also as a side issue, it's worth keeping photos that are slightly flawed so you can look at them and learn from them, and maybe even see some development in your own photography, that you are learning from your mistakes and not repeating the same mistakes over and over. Or maybe you are. But it's probably a good idea to try to learn from these things rather than just keep repeating them. But anyway, that's it. I'll leave you with this image. Yeah, if you like what you see, please consider subscribing and click like on the image, because that's what the YouTube algorithms feed on, apparently. And any comments will be gratefully received. See you next time.